The police state has now been well and truly unleashed against student protesters across the entire United States. And the real question here is why? Why is this happening? Why are these protests being met with such violence from the authorities? Well, that's because in the United States, the police and the military, the authorities, are really here to only defend existing institutional interests from challenges to their power. And which institutional interest am I talking about here? Well, of course, the military industrial complex, which absolutely dominates and controls American foreign policy decisions. And when there's any sort of resistance against that, this is the reaction that you get, and you see it time and time and time again throughout American history with protests against things like the Vietnam War, and in the modern times against people like Julian Assange, which have revealed the true nature of what it means to go to war in foreign lands and the death and destruction that that brings, despite however you might try to wrap it up as being in the interests of peace and democracy. Yeah, that's not the goal of American foreign policy whatsoever. It's nowhere near close to the real goal. And the only way that you could overturn a set of institutional interests like this is with a mass movement from the ground up. And of course, that is what these protests in and of themselves represent, which is why they have to be crushed by the police state, which is propping this whole system of fraud and lies and death and militarism up. And it's been propping it up for decades at this point. And what has this reaction from the American police state also facilitated over the last few days of this week? Well, it means that all of the war crimes that are slowly but surely now coming to light that have been committed by the Israeli military over the months of its ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza are now being swept under the rug and forgotten about and not really being spoken about as much in the media, because the media is all focused now on this student protest movement and the reaction to it, as opposed to the discovery of mass graves by the hospitals that the Israeli military has been raiding, and the ongoing slaughter of children that's been going on in Gaza. So while this does represent perhaps the beginning of a mass movement against the military-industrial complex, that's really the long-term goal here, or it should be at least. In the short term, we're losing all focus on the thousands of people that are continuing to be slaughtered every single week and month as this conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is allowed to drag on and on and on. And of course, we've seen a lot of cherry picking that's been going on in regards to these student protests. And there have been some really nasty things that have been said and done at these protests. There have been anti-Semitic events. There have been calls for violence at these protests. The problem is that is absolutely not representative of the whole in these protests. And when you do that, it's very clear that all you're trying to do is just smear the other side for political gain. And of course, we're seeing some conservatives that are falling into this trap quite heavily, or let's say so-called conservatives, because these were the people that were pushing really hard for free speech on campus. And all of a sudden, when there's some free speech that they don't really like so much, well, let's go ahead and send in the police. Let's go ahead and send in the heavies and start cracking some skulls. Well, yeah, again, the only useful thing that comes out of that is that these people are exposing themselves and really showing us who we should and should not be paying attention to. Anyone that's on this left, right, good versus bad, liberal versus conservative paradigm is leading you down the wrong path. The real enemies, if you want to call them that, are the institutional interests that have been institutional interests for decades, and they still have power to this very day. And brief side note as well, what is the possibility that these protests have been infiltrated by the, quote, authorities to try to stir up violence? There's a long storied history of this in the United States, and violence, of course, begets violence. And if you start acting in a very violent way against mostly peaceful protests, which is really what these are if we're being truthful, what do you think you may get from that? You may get people that react in a violent manner to the violence that has been brought upon them. I'm Stuart Hooper, an independent lecturer and researcher in geopolitics. Be sure to follow me here if you are new. Hit like on this and share it everywhere you possibly can. I'm approaching international politics from a critical angle. We're not trying to take sides necessarily here. We're trying to cut through all of the left versus right, liberal versus conservative, all of that crap, and get to the reality of who is really in charge, who really matters, and where the real power structures are. Because that is not a bunch of students on a campus somewhere. The real institutional power in the United States is the military-industrial complex, and it's been that way for a very long time. So let's take a look at some headlines here. Let's take a look at what's been going on, and we can make some progress, hopefully, in trying to figure out precisely how this has all happened. So it began with defiance at Columbia University in New York. And now, of course, these student protests are nationwide, and they are getting larger and larger and larger. And here is the central reason, again, why we have such authoritarian responses to this. Look at this placard right here. End all US aid to Israel. Shut it down. This is the true message that should apply not only to Israel, but any other country around the world that's waging a ridiculous conflict. Because if you really want to turn the country around and send it in a better direction, all of this so-called aid to the wider world that's really just facilitating these conflicts, it's got to come to an end. So that is the real message here. It's an anti-war message. I would say that's even more so the point of these protests than even the so-called anti-Zionist message. And of course, there's all of the distinctions that are being made that you've all heard. Being anti-Zionist is not being an anti-Semite. Being against Netanyahu is not being an anti-Semite. Being against the war in Gaza is not being an anti-Semite. Let's just remove all of those labels out of the discussion. Let's remove the identity politics out of the discussion, because that doesn't help. And that just puts people in two separate camps. Let's talk about the real issue here, and that's war, the conflict, the global conflict that's now been going on for decades and decades and decades. And only the military-industrial complex has benefited from this. And briefly here, we have a short history of US law enforcement infiltrating protests. Oh, isn't that interesting? You don't hear too much about that on the evening news, do you? And if you scroll down here, this article gives a nice little overview of the history, but this paragraph sums it up nicely. It is a historical fact that law enforcement frequently infiltrates progressive political movements using agent provocateurs who urge others to engage in violence. It is also a historical fact, more rarely, such provocateurs commit acts of violence themselves. Indeed, the government only gets more powerful when it is facing violence, because then it can justify the continued accumulation of power and then exertion of that power onto its own populace when it's facing a violent response. Why not go and stir up a violent response of your own? Why not create a false flag incident? It only benefits you if you are the government. That's the reality here. We need to be able to deal with that. If you can't deal with that, you have no business dealing in the discussion of international affairs. Let's take a look at some of this. This is a university professor being completely overrun by violent force from police officers. Let's take a look at this.
I just saw.
Let's just take one more brief look at that, right? Look at this. Look at that. Look at that. They are willing to rip this woman's arms literally out of their sockets because she is standing up and saying this war in Gaza is wrong, it's out of control, and it needs to end. This is what the American police state is willing to do to individuals that make such claims. Here's another one. Yep, get those batons out. Let's start cracking skulls. We've got some anti-war protesters on campus. Let's go ahead and start smashing them in line. Now, again, when this is the response, it's pretty fair to say that you are usually in the right. If you are protesting something that gets a response like this, you're probably on the right side of history. Those that are cracking skulls, probably on the wrong side of history. That's just a good general rule of thumb, isn't it? Now, how is this all going to be framed? Well, this was an interesting one. This is out of the UK. Foreign states are targeting UK universities, MI5 warns. Vice chancellors from 24 leading universities were briefed on the threat by the security services and the government on Thursday. They were warned cutting-edge research could be targeted by states to boost their own militaries and economies. What they're really saying here is anyone that challenges us and our authority, us and our foreign policy decisions, us and our military-industrial complex, us and our militarism and global transnational empire, the only people that could possibly be against that are foreign states, foreign spies, the Russians, the Iranians. Oh, wait a second. What's that? The Iranians? Hold that thought.
About time that the presidents and the campus administrators across the country started again simply saying, you got to play by the rules. I mean, talk about the height of entitlement, right? Thinking that you can just act with impunity wherever you want. You know, it's funny, we're talking about Iran a few minutes ago. Iran has their military proxies like Hezbollah, and Iran has their campus proxies like these groups like SJP and JVP. That, I mean, look at them. I mean, this is literally like a demonstration in Tehran, and you can't believe it's happening in Morningside Heights. So, as you know, President Shafiq testified before Congress on Wednesday.
Look at that. That is unbelievable. That is unbelievable. These are the same pool of worldviews that argued the only way Trump could have ever gotten elected was by Russian interference. Yeah, it wasn't the fact that establishment politicians have dominated American politics for decades and run the country into the ground, and people were looking for literally any other option except Hillary Clinton. No, it had to be the Russians. This is the same line of argument. People will only oppose the military-industrial complex. They will only oppose our foreign policy decisions. They'll only oppose the idea of spreading democracy, of freedom around the world, if they're being infiltrated and directed by some nefarious foreign actor. This is absolutely ridiculous. It's literally the political establishment spitting in the face of its people and saying your views not only do not matter, but are completely invalid. And we're never, ever going to listen to them. That's really what's going on here. Continuing. Let's get rid of this foreign state stuff. Here's I thought this might be just useful for comparison. Here's a clip from back in 2019 in Hong Kong. Oh yeah, look at that. Spraying that guy directly in the face. That guy's real tough, that police officer. That's a real tough guy right there. Knee to the neck. baton to the head, pepper spray to the face. That's a real tough guy right there. Point being, you remember when the Western media was all over this stuff? This was a disaster. This is why you can't trust China. This is why the Chinese government's out of control. This is what would never happen in the United States, in the Western world, in the UK, in France. We would never act like this. We support freedom of speech and political protest. Well, really, here's Texas. And you can hear that really violent message in the background, right? Listen closely. Free Palestine. Yeah, that message of mass violence. This is where we are. The American government is admitting to all of us with this police state response that there is a way out of a government and foreign policy establishment that is bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex, by the neocons, the neoliberals, the people on the left and the right who think that endless war is a good thing, the people that think you can bring peace and democracy by dropping bombs on foreign lands and foreign people. They have just admitted their weakness. If we can get a mass movement across not only the United States, but places like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, any central, western, global north nation against this stuff, there is a chance, a small, teeny, tiny chance, that we may be able to bring this to an end. Again, to reiterate, are there some crazy people in these protests mixed in with all of this? Yes. Is that always the case in every protest in human history? Yes. Are some of these people probably infiltrators trying to incite violence to give the authorities more power than they already have? Yes. This is not a cut and dry issue. This is not a woke, anti-woke issue. This isn't, I would argue, not even a free speech issue. This is are you in favor of endless war, endless conflict, endless militarism, endless empire, or are you not? Because most people, regardless of what label you put on yourself, you need to be in the latter camp. This empire, this militarism, it does not benefit you. It sells out your future, your children, your livelihoods, the state of the country right here domestically. It's all being sold down the river for a transnational empire that needs to come to an end. Remember to hit like on this video, share it everywhere you possibly can, and I'll be back with more real soon. I appreciate the support from all of you guys out there. I'm going to keep focusing on this and we'll see how it develops. And we're also going to go back and take a look at those mass graves and the atrocities that have come to light over the past week. And we'll probably do that tomorrow. Thank you all for watching. I'll be back with more real soon.